All right, let's just jump right in. Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're cracking open a tabletop RPG mechanic that completely ditches that old-school spell-casting bloat we are all so used to. We're talking about mastering magic and the rule of cool in Gateway RPG. We're going to look at how its dynamic magic system works and how game masters can use this rule of cool to unleash some true narrative freedom at the table. So, first off, are you tired of spending half your combat turn calculating spell slots? Look, if you've played standard TTRPGs, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You want your wizard to do something absolutely epic, right? But then, bam, you're suddenly reading 3 dense paragraphs of spell text, double-checking your remaining level 3 slots, and trying to calculate exactly how many feet a cone of cold extends. It literally grinds the narrative pacing to a halt. It takes you totally out of the story and forces you right into the math. And that right there is exactly the problem Gateway sets out to solve. You have the old way, which is complex lists, spell slots, and math, and then you have the Gateway way, describe, roll, and narrate. It completely removes the baggage of those endless charts. Instead of opening a separate book just to find out if you can cast a simple spark, you just look at the situation, describe your intent to the game master, roll your d20, and narrate the outcome. It's a problem-solution approach, and it keeps the game fast and focused entirely on the storytelling. Okay, so how does this actually work mechanically on your character sheet? Let's look at the narrative magic mechanic. In Gateway, your magical capability relies primarily on your base character traits. So magic attacks and spells simply use the wisdom trait. But say you're in a sci-fi or cyberpunk setting, well, tech and computer use, like hacking a mainframe, is handled identically using your intelligence trait. There are literally no complex spell lists required here. You just describe your spell's intent to the GM, like, hey, I want to summon a small fireball to light this torch, and the GM takes it from there. Now, instead of a rigid rulebook dictating if a spell hits or misses, the game master determines success on the fly by setting a difficulty class, or DC. As you can see, it's a sliding scale based strictly on the challenge in front of you. A simple task might just be a DC of 2 to 5. Easy is 6 to 10, moderate is 11 to 15, hard is 16 to 19, all the way up to near impossible, which is a 20 or higher. You just roll your d20, factor in your trait proficiency, and if you meet or beat that DC number, your magic works. Simple as that. Let's move into our next section, genre-hopping magic examples, and setting the difficulty class on the fly. Since Gateway is built for everything from high fantasy to modern espionage, the game master has to get comfortable setting these DCs in real time, based purely on the scenario. Let's walk through 3 completely different examples to see how a GM actually evaluates the fiction to set that DC. First up, let's do a classic high fantasy setting. A half-elf wizard casts a wall of flame to block a narrow dungeon corridor. Say they're being chased, and the player says this is their intent. The GM considers it for a second. Blocking a narrow doorway, that's a pretty standard, expected use of fire magic. It takes skill, sure, but it's not crazy. So the GM sets a moderate DC of 11, the player rolls their wisdom trait, and if they hit an 11 or higher, boom, the flames erupt. Now let's jump across the galaxy to a space opera. We've got Duke Starslayer, the space wizard, and he uses the Force to hold open a collapsing heavy blast door so his friends can escape. The GM looks at this and thinks, okay, that blast door weighs tons. Holding it up is going to be incredibly taxing on the character, so the GM determines this is a hard task. Setting the DC at 16, Duke's player has to roll their wisdom trait against that 16 just to keep them all from being crushed. And finally, let's dive into a gritty cyberpunk world where magic is basically high-level tech. A street hacker deploys a logic bomb against top-tier corporate security ICE. The GM knows this megacorp has the best digital defenses money can buy, right? Breaching it shouldn't just be hard, it should be monumental. So the GM sets the DC at 20, making it near impossible. The hacker is going to have to roll their intelligence trait and pray for a miracle to crack that system. Which brings us perfectly to our next topic, attempting the impossible, and why game masters should never just say no. Look, what happens when a player asks to do something with their magic that just completely shatters the limits of their abilities? Something so wild that your very first instinct as a GM is to say, no way, you can't do that. Well, the ultimate toolkit secret in Gateway is that you almost never say no. You let the mechanics handle the impossibility for you. And this is exactly where the disadvantage mechanic comes in. If a character is deficient in a trait, or if the situation is just incredibly unfavorable, they roll with disadvantage, meaning roll 2d20 and take the lower result. A GM can impose this dynamically whenever a player's magical request is really stretching the bounds of reality, or if the environment is fiercely working against them. So when that player asks to cast a spell to literally pull a meteor down from the sky or hack into a satellite using a busted datapad, you don't shut them down. You set the difficulty class to a flat 20, the absolute maximum. And on top of that, you impose disadvantage. You make them roll those 2d20s and take the lowest. They are going to need a natural 20 on the dice to pull this off, a critical success. It shifts the burden. You're no longer the bad guy GM saying no. You're letting the dice decide if a truly legendary moment is about to happen. They just have to really earn it. This entire philosophy is anchored right in the core rulebook. Quote, "A great GM should embrace the rule of cool, allowing players to produce creative and unconventional ideas for their characters." The text explicitly states that rewarding creativity and keeping the story moving is always more important than strict math. When you encourage this kind of innovation, it empowers your players to think completely outside the box. Letting them at least attempt the role creates a super unpredictable, highly engaging game for everyone at the table. So the big takeaway for game masters here is this simple 4-step masterclass approach. Step 1, the player describes an impossible magical feat. Step 2, the GM swallows that instinct to say no and replies with, "Yes, but." Step 3, the GM applies the mechanics, setting the DC to 20 and imposing disadvantage. And finally, step 4, everyone leans in and you roll the dice to discover the epic narrative outcome. If they fail, it's a spectacular failure. But if they succeed, man, that is a moment your table will be talking about for years. By prioritizing the story over a spreadsheet of spell slots, Gateway RPG gives both the game master and the players the freedom to truly unleash their imaginations. It brings the focus right back to why we play these games in the first place, right? To tell incredible stories together. So, knowing that the system rewards creativity and that the rule of cool reigns supreme, what impossible feat will you attempt at your next session?